Hey guys, we're here for a little bit of a different time today.
We are.
Still Thursday, we're still kicking on with some question time, but we've got a very different question today.
Yeah.
Something that's actually going to take a bit of time. We're going to dive really deep into this topic today. So if you're watching, maybe grab a cuppa, maybe do something on the side, do some stretches, do your laundry if you need to.
Absolutely.
But have a listen. We're just going to have a chat about this question that someone from Tuesday Night Live has brought up to you personally, Seno. And it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
So the question itself, in general, is about Genesis, Genesis 1, creation, what's going on there.
Yeah.
At the heart of this question that we're going to try and look into today is how should we read Genesis 1 and what do we do with the knowledge and the understanding that comes out from that.
Yeah.
We're not going to answer perhaps maybe the way that some people want us to answer this question, but what we're going to do is we're going to go through how do we actually come up against this question. How do we ourselves take the measures to actually understand it a little bit more so we can get out of it?
I think this is a tough one, and it's tough for a few reasons, because quite often when we're talking to friends who aren't Christian, and maybe you're out there and you're listening to this and you're not Christian and you're going, you Christians are idiots on this. And that's often the thing Christian gets, you guys are just stupid. And so we feel, I feel so attacked. We tend to feel the pressure from people who are friends of ours who aren't Christian who go, this just makes Christianity so unbelievable that you believe this when obviously it's just not true. But then there's also an issue inside the church, because Christians argue about this amongst themselves. We're not of one mind inside the church about this. We don't all think the same thing, and that creates a tension for us as well, because what should I think? Do I agree with you? And so Bible study groups and churches can often, we struggle with this. We have trouble with it. We have trouble talking about it and preaching about it in church because there's a bit of a stink amongst Christians about it. So there's actually two different things. And I think today what I'm going to do first of all is talk about the internal stink that Christians have about this. Why are we having a fight about it inside our churches in a sense, and what can we do about that, and what are some useful tools to help us think that through and come to our own convictions and deal with each other about that. I guess a question for another day is, how do we talk about this with our non-Christian friends? And if you're not a Christian out there, how do we have a conversation about it that's useful and profitable and isn't just slagging off at each other? So that may be another day. And so if you've got questions about this, feel free to post them. Particularly as you get to the end of the discussion, you think, he hasn't answered this and I want to know this. That's completely fine. One thing I should say right at the outset today is I am not going to talk about the science of Darwinism. I do have a background in science. My background is not evolutionary biology or anything like that. It's a different form of science. But I won't be dealing with those particular questions today. So if you've got questions about that, feel free to post them, and maybe I'll post something about them later on. Or at least post some links to things. But that's not going to be our topic today, just so you're aware.
Okay. So to help us out, you've talked about that kind of the hardship between the church and between people who do believe. For those of us who are believers, who do follow Christ, help us. What do we start with in terms of
where do we begin?
How can we clear the air for all of us out there to put us on a level playing ground when we start thinking about this topic?
And I think this is actually important, because one of the things I want to do is actually help Christians to take the pressure off each other a little bit and be a little less antagonistic. And so I want to say 4 things at the outset that will help to clear the air a bit and help us to actually approach this question amongst ourselves a bit more fruitfully. So here are my four, if you like, clearing the air principles. Firstly, we all believe in the God who created the world, right? Christians are not arguing amongst themselves that some Christians are arguing that God created the world and others are going, well, no, he didn't. It just happened by evolution or something. No, all of us believe God created the world, and all Christians believe that God created us, humanity, uniquely in the world. We're not arguing about that. Secondly, we all believe in the Bible. It's not that one group of Christians is arguing that the Bible is true and the other group of Christians is arguing the Bible isn't true. We all believe the Bible's true. That's really important. So please don't make that your argument. That's not what we're talking about. Thirdly, we all read the Bible literally. I often come up against this, often we think we're having this discussion being, well, I take the Bible literally, but you don't. You're just kind of messing around with it. All of us read the Bible literally because the Bible is literature and you have to read literature literally. That means different things at different points.
Yeah.
When we read the Psalms, we don't read them as an epistle or a letter. We read them as poetry, and we see the symbolism. When we read in the Psalms that God is a rock, we don't think in our heads God is literally a rock. We know that's a metaphor.
We understand the genre that it's in.
Yeah. Well, we understand it's a metaphor. It's describing something about God, his faithfulness and his steadfastness, and you can rely on him and trust him, and he brings you safety. So we read things as what they are. And so this is not an argument about people taking the Bible literally. All of us take the Bible literally. The question is, what is Genesis 1 talking about literally? And the fourth one is, we all believe in science. So it's not that some of us believe in science and others are just, rednecks who don't believe in science and they're, idiots. No, all of us actually believe in science because all of us believe God made the world to be understood. God made people in the world for the world to be discoverable and knowable. And science is part of that project. As we look at the world and we work out things about it and use those things we work out to actually live in the world well and to improve the way we live in the world, that is science, and all of us do science. And it doesn't matter where we fall on this discussion, we all believe in science. So it's not that some of us believe in science and some of us are silly. No, we all believe in science. So I want those things to be out there at the outset because that is not the conversation we're having. Okay, it's not science, non-science, it's not Bible versus non-Bible. We're Christians together, and we agree on those things. So what I find with this conversation is that it's like we're all standing on the edge of a cliff and we're just taking turns pushing each other off. You don't believe in the Bible, or you're an idiot, you just don't believe in science. That's not what's going on. So let's just back away from the cliff and just stop pushing each other around and actually have the conversation that we should be having.
Because this conversation is not new. This
No.
conversation has been happening for a very long time. And you made a point about that, we're pushing each other off the cliff. Has it always been that way when this conversation's been happening? So let's take it back. Let's go back to perhaps the start.
The very beginning of the church,
How did this conversation come about?
Yeah.
What's going on? And what was the conversation actually about?
Yeah.
Has it always
It's worth realising that when you dig down, when you go all the way back and look at what our Christian brothers and sisters in the very earliest centuries of the church were saying about Genesis 1 and the Bible, there's a lot of difference. There were some that took it to be talking about a kind of literalistic 6 days in Genesis 1. Others took it in a figurative way or a symbolic way or a metaphorical way and there were a range of different understandings of Genesis 1 and what it was talking about. And in those early centuries of the church, that was no biggie. It was no big deal. It was a disagreement. We read the text differently, but we saw the Bible giving us permission to read it those different ways, and it was not a big deal because everyone believed that however we were understanding this, that God was the creator of the world. We understood the important things that Genesis 1 was teaching us, and that didn't change. And so it wasn't a big deal. It was just we drifted along, and that was true for roughly 1850 years. For 18 and a half centuries. Christians disagreed about this. People wrote different things, but we did not have the kind of fight we're having today, where the stakes are so high. And so you ask the question, well,
what happened?
Why? What happened?
Yeah, what changed to make it not so friendly?
Not so friendly, yeah. Well, it's kind of Darwin's fault, really.
Who's Darwin? Who is he?
Charles Darwin was a natural philosopher and scientist in the 1800s, and in the 1830s, I think it was, he went on a famous voyage on the ship the Beagle around the world and observed the natural world. And he's part of a scientific discussion that had been going on for decades and centuries. And so he's not the only person to have done this. Darwinism didn't emerge out of thin air, out of Darwin's head. He's building on the work of many other people. And in 1859, he publishes a seminal book that is the kind of the collecting together of all his thoughts about these things. And it's called On the Origin of Species, is the short version of the title. And he, in that book, he talks about his theory of what he calls evolution by natural selection. That all of the all of the species of animal in the world came about naturally by a process over a long period of time, and the mechanism that was used was natural selection. And so he writes this book to explain, how we get to where we are, and that includes humanity.
Yeah.
And so it's this all-encompassing theory of the natural world, the biological world, that it came about through this process of natural selection, evolution by natural selection.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the explosion of different species around the world happened from very simple origins in perhaps one organism at one point, or a few different organisms. That's his basic theory.
Yeah.
And he publishes this book in 1859, and everything just goes ballistic.
But why? Because why was it so different than what was already being said?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, it wasn't. That's the funny thing. It wasn't any different to what had been talking about for a long time. And the funny thing is, if you can call it funny, a lot of Christians were involved in doing the science.
Yeah.
That's the background to this work. A lot of Christians in particular were involved in geology and believed in an old Earth. That idea of an Earth that's billions of years old.
Yeah.
And they did not see that as any problem. And that was an idea that had been around for quite a while before Darwin. And so why this book? I think it's because of how it was used. So I think what Darwin was doing was basically, we talked about this earlier, I think his motivation was to justify his agnosticism. Yeah. He's a growing agnostic with his natural science, and so he's using his theory to justify that to his very Christian wife. Yeah. This is why I'm agnostic. But he really wasn't interested in public spats and fights. He wasn't interested in kicking up a big stink. Maybe a little bit, but more of a passive-aggressive way. I'll publish a book. But other people were. There's a famous guy called Thomas Huxley, who they call Darwin's bulldog, and he was an atheist, and he saw Darwin's work as a seminal moment where he's collected together all these different ideas and he's provided an explanation. And for a guy like Huxley, who's an atheist, this book explained for him everything about the world and all of life without God. And so for him, he's going, here's a satisfactory explanation without God. For the first time, someone's given me a tool to understand my life without God. And so he grabbed hold of it and he used it. And there's a famous series of debates where Huxley was debating Christians, bishops and other Christians over the faith in the 1860s, where he's using these ideas. And so Huxley basically takes this book and uses it as a stick to beat Christians over the head with. And that, you can imagine, you've got to have some response as Christians, don't you?
Yeah, because all of a sudden it's no longer raising the question of how did God do this?
Yeah.
Because I think that's something as well that we need to clarify is that's what the discussion was. It was how did God create the earth? Yeah. Not whether he did or whether he didn't. And so, there's two main thoughts that come out of that, and it's the 6-day creation versus a longer period, which is when you started talking about the longer earth and the older the earth is.
And people often talk about theistic evolution. I want to leave that aside for the moment and just say an old earth, some version of an old earth.
Yeah. And so now though, there's this other angle that people are bringing in, that it actually raises this question about God at all.
Yes.
And so all of a sudden, this friendly discussion that's happening within the church about, how did God, how do we talk about how God's done this? How do we see his hand at work? Yeah. There's now all of a sudden, I guess you could say, they have to defend the faith. It's about them defending what they actually believe in.
And historically, I think, and once again, this is my opinion, I don't think there's a book written about this, but from what I've observed, I think what happened is the reason that Christians are arguing about it so antagonistically today is because we were trying to deal with this question that's coming from outside. And so Huxley's saying you don't need God anymore. Here's an explanation for everything. Without God, we don't need God. Christians then have, I think, two basic responses. I call the responses so what and no way. Okay. They're the two basic responses. So the first response was from all these Christians who'd been part of this discussion for a long time. And they've seen evidence of old earth and all these sorts of things. That hasn't challenged their faith. And their response was, so what? what all you've really talked about is some kind of scientific mechanism for an explanation of how it might have happened, and it isn't tested yet. You've got to work that out. But so what? That doesn't answer the question of how and why. It doesn't answer the question. Doesn't answer the question of why we are the way we are. Why we even ask this. Why are we actually exploring this question? No other animal species is asking the question, why am I here and how does the world come about? We are. Why is that? Why are we who we are? Why is the world the way it is? That why question is not answered. And also the question that's not answered is, where does it all come from anyway?
Yeah.
And so there was this popular belief back in those days the universe was eternal. That matter was eternal. It just existed eternally. But that's just patently not true. It had a beginning.
Yeah.
And so Christians have just these Christians just went, well, so what?
Yeah, so it's kind of, if it's hit them and they've just kind of let it bounce off. They're like, it does not affect me. It doesn't change me.
So one way of answering this question to the world, doing apologetics, defending the faith, was to say, so what?
Yeah.
You've not really done anything. And so they say to Huxley, you're being a bit of a doofus because you can't use evidence in a closed system of science to prove something outside of it. You can't prove anything about God from talking about evolution. It just doesn't make sense. And so they went, so what? Yeah. But another group of Christians went, hang on a minute, no way, this can't be right, because you cannot say that God didn't create that sort of thing. And so their response was, it can't be true. Yeah. This can't be right. And so those people then very much just, retreated back into a very, most of these retreated to a very literalistic view of Genesis and went, no way, this can't be right. And so they're the two responses. They were going, and so they wanted to say, no, Darwin can't be right, definitely can't be right because God's right. Yeah. And so there's two ways that Christians are answering this to the outside, but then you've got...
Yeah, so how did it turn? Because that's the thing, we're talking them talking about the outside, but how did they turn against each other?
Well, Christians are people like other people. We're pretty good at turning on each other at different times, aren't we? And this was one of those moments where these two arguments, they can't both work at the same time, right? It can't be so what and no way. Yeah. It's got to be one or the other, doesn't it? And so they then needed to deal with each other. And so we often focus in this on the arguments with the outside world and the struggles that we had there. But underneath this is brewing this argument inside the church between the no ways and the so whats. And so you'll see that already around, you'll even see that today. So this is the 1850s and 60s, 160 years later, this fight, this rubbing up against each other is still happening inside the church. We're still going, no way, and so what? And it feels like we can't live with each other. Yeah. And so a conversation that was just a conversation that wasn't terribly loaded, that we were okay to have, we weren't accusing each other of being non-Christians or being complete fools, now has all of a sudden become loaded with lots of freight. Yeah. Are you a genuine Christian if you don't think the same way as me? Yeah. Do you actually take the Bible seriously if you don't believe what I believe? Because what I believe takes the Bible seriously, but it seems like you're not. Yeah. And so what I'd like to do today is actually take that first step and talk to Christians about the way we read our Bible. Yeah. And in particular, what I want to do is look at what the Bible actually says about a 6 literal 24-hour period creation idea. What are the evidence from the Bible for that? But also, particularly for those of you who are a bit more no way and 6 day, I actually want to show you some evidence for the Bible for a longer time frame. Not for theistic evolution as a thing, but for an understanding of an older earth. Because I think you'll be surprised that there is evidence in the Bible, in Genesis 1 and 2, and in the Bible as a whole, for understanding that this Genesis 1 more figuratively or symbolically. Yeah. And so I want to show both sides of that. Yeah. And so that Christians then, no matter what side of this discussion you fall on, I'm not saying you can't be no way or you can't be so what, but that we don't perhaps fight so vigorously amongst ourselves about it.
So it's as much about understanding each other and the other side. Yep. So that we understand where we sit, but we can also understand why people are coming from that other point of view, and how perhaps they're not wrong. Yeah. And we're not right. Yep. It's about, we actually don't have any full-on answers. We cannot answer. We are not God ourselves. We cannot answer this.
And it's okay where it's ambiguous to be forgiving of one another. Okay. And that's what we ought to be. Yeah. And so what I won't do today, I won't tell you what I think, and I won't tell you what to think. Yeah, definitely. This is just about us providing the information that has been given. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get into it then.
Yep.
Let's start with the 6-day creation.
Yep. Okay.
Where do we even start with that? How do we get to that point?
Yep. And so the other thing I should say at the outset as we put the 4 ideas up is that I'm not talking about ideas outside the Bible. I just want to look at what does the Bible actually say?
Yep.
What evidence, because we're all Bible people, remember, and so that's what I want to talk about. What is the biblical evidence that justifies us thinking a certain way?
Yep.
So here are the 4. You may think there's other biblical evidence, and that's fine. You may have other reasons. Feel free to post them if you like. But here are 4 things, I think, 4 strong arguments for believing in a 6 24-hour days for the framework of the creation of the world. And the first is the simple one. The word day means day. I think it's the word olam or whatever, but it's the Hebrew word used in Genesis 1 for day just means day. It's the general word for day. Yeah. And so usually when you're reading things, you tend to take them as they are unless you've got permission to read them otherwise. So the word rock means rock unless you really know it's being used as a metaphor. Yeah. And so the word day just means day, and generally speaking, we would take that to be a day, a circuit of the Earth around the Sun.
A day that we know.
Sorry, not a circuit of the Earth around the Sun. That's a year. One cycle of the Earth turning on its axis. Yeah. The second reason is that it actually doesn't come from Genesis 1, it comes from Exodus 20. In Exodus 20 verse 11, when Moses is giving the law to Israel, he talks about the Sabbath. And in talking about the Sabbath, he says, in 6 days God created the world, and on the 7th he rested. That's a reason why we should have the Sabbath, the principle of rest. And so he uses this argument. He says, 6 days, so rest. And it's worth also remembering along those lines that Genesis was written at the same time as Exodus. Yeah. These things were revealed to Israel through Moses from God. And that this is the revealed history. They don't have access to this historically. There's no way they can know this. It's revealed by God about their origin. So the Exodus 20 connection. The third reason actually comes from the book of 2 Peter, where it talks about the world being formed out of water and by water, which is a reference straight back to Genesis 1. And seems to, you could argue that seems to indicate a more literal reading of Genesis chapter 1. Yeah. The idea of the waters and the separation of the waters. And so that seems to indicate that perhaps Genesis 1 is being read literally by Peter. Yeah. And then the fourth argument is more of a logic argument in the Bible. Can there be death before sin? The whole idea of evolution is that things happen through natural selection, dying, lots of death. Yeah. Can that exist before sin? And so
what does that really mean? How does that prove the 6 days?
It doesn't really prove the 6 days. It's just an argument that people use that there doesn't seem to be any death in Genesis. Yeah, okay. Chapter 1. Not until Genesis chapter 3, post the fall. And so how can death exist before the fall, before sin exists in the world? So it's more of a logic argument than a text argument.
Yeah, okay.
But now, as far as I can tell, they're the four main text-based arguments positively for 6-day creation. There are other arguments we might talk about, and often they're arguments that are refuting the other side. And so people often bring up, well, if you don't take this literally, then is Adam just a metaphor or symbolic? He's not a real person. What does that do to Romans chapter 5 and Jesus and Adam? And so there are arguments that are kind of negative in the sense against the other side. Yeah, okay. And I'll let you bring those up. That's fine. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time discussing the to's and fro's of that. Yeah. They're actually about working out the kinks of your own way of thinking. Yeah. Right? And I think that's a valid question to ask someone who's actually takes a longer view of Genesis and thinks this might be metaphorical or symbolic. What do they do with Adam? It's a valid question to ask, and someone who's got this side needs to actually think about those things. Yeah. Okay, so there'll be questions for both sides from the Bible that are more negative. I just want to focus on what are the positive arguments. So they are the 4 positive arguments. A day is a day, the use of the Sabbath, Peter's quoted in 2 Peter 3, and then that idea of death before the fall. What are the arguments for a longer time frame? Yeah. Why might someone believe that the world was created in a longer time frame by reading the Bible itself?
Yes. By reading the exact same passage.
The exact same passages.
The whole Bible that the other people have.
Yep. And so once again, we'll do some text arguments and some wider Bible theology arguments. So here they are. Here is my my list. First, the language of Genesis chapter 1. So I think I need to now get my list back up. The language of Genesis 1 is somewhere between prose and poetry. It is wrong to say Genesis 1 is a poem. It's not a poem, and so you're correct about that. But it's also not the same as a normal historical account. It's in some sense a kind of elevated prose, and you see that in the symbolism and the numbers. So verse 1 has 7 words, verse 2 has 14 words. This is kind of structure that's it's not poetry, but it's semi-poetic. It reads a little bit like some kind of structured poetical account.
Yeah, and we see
poetry.
that because there is confusion when we read it, and
Yeah.
we're like, wait, but didn't that happen? Or especially with the, it talks about how mankind was made, because it comes up a couple of times, and all of a sudden you're like, why would it come up again?
Yeah, well, we'll get to
if
that.
it's already happened.
Yeah, we're going to get to that because we'll come back around to that. Yeah. So that's the first argument, that even though Genesis 1 is not poetry, it's certainly not simple historical prose either.
No.
It doesn't read like a history.
Yeah.
And you see that when you actually get down and dig into the original Hebrew.
Yeah.
The second argument is the analogy of God's working week. And this actually is another actual version of the Moses argument. This is written by Moses to Israel, and he's using, the argument is he's using language and ideas that Israel would understand. If you're an Israelite farmer, you go out and you work for 6 days, you rest. This is a structure that makes sense, and so it's a metaphor for how God created that makes sense of the idea of work. Because what God's trying to do is to talk about being in the image of God.
Yeah.
We're going to come to this in a couple of weeks at Tuesday Night Live, and we talk about work. Yeah. We're going to dig back into creation and work. But the idea here is that Moses shows us creation as God at work and working for a week, because that's analogous to us working for a week. And what he's trying to show is that we are like God in this. We're in the image of God. We too are workers. And our work is creative and building and bringing order to the world. Just as God brought order to a chaotic world, we bring order to a chaotic world. And so the idea of an analogy. So that analogy lends them to think it's actually being used symbolically or metaphorically. The third argument is the days themselves aren't measured, and the seventh day doesn't end. I don't know if you noticed this, but he talks about the evening and the morning, but he doesn't talk about the day itself. And so, what is he talking about? And so that's just a little kind of text argument. But the idea of the seventh day doesn't end. What do you do when you come to an account and the seventh day just kind of drops off the edge of a cliff? It doesn't have an end point.
Yeah, there's no eighth day, there's no ninth day. Yeah.
That might, if the seventh day is somehow symbolic, well, why isn't the
rest
why
of it?
The first six?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's the third one. The fourth one is actually what we brought up earlier. That the creation week must belong to harmonise Genesis 1 and 2. You've actually got more than one account of the creation of humanity. You've got the Genesis 1 account on day 6 as part of the creation of all the animals, but you also have the Genesis 2 account, which is about the uniqueness of humanity, and reads very differently. And it is. I think people who argue for a longer earth would argue it's problematic to synchronise those 2 days. They would think, and so that the best way to harmonise Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 is to see them as two reflections on creation, not as two things that need to be that happened at the the events of chapter 2 don't seem to be able to be put into a 12-hour day.
Yeah, exactly.
That God brought all of the animals in the world to Adam to name, that he named them all in the first 6 hours. And then God put him to sleep for a couple of hours and then woke him up, and then what's the time scale that makes Genesis 6 Genesis 2 makes sense of Genesis 1. And so that's actually, I think, for many people who believe in a longer time frame, a fairly strong kind of argument. They just go, this doesn't make sense if you have to read these two things together. The fifth argument, we're going to the second page, is that verse 1 seems to happen outside of the 6 days. So, and this is actually quite a strong argument from the text, that verses 1 and 2 are like a heading. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is creation, what they call ex nihilo, or from or out of nothing. God created the universe out of nothing, and he did it instantaneously. He didn't do it in 6 days. He did it instantaneously. Verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what you see in verse 2 is this creation is chaotic. It's dark and messy and chaotic. And so what happens then is God goes to work on that creation. And so some people, there's been an opinion among some Christians that the creation of the world took an enormously long time, and then God went to work for 6 days and brought order to it. And so the 6 days are seen as God bringing order to this thing that he made, and he made chaotic.
Yeah.
And that fits with that symbolism of God's working week and our working week, because what do? We take a world that's chaotic and we bring order to it. So verse 1 seems to happen outside of the 6 days, which suggests that there's some period of time that's not within the 6 days at the very least.
Yeah.
Sixth argument, Genesis shares similarities with other ancient creation texts. This is a relatively weak argument because it's an outside argument, but the argument is that Genesis is a creation account that looks a bit like the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, and that it's meant as a Jewish answer to their polytheistic kind of creation accounts.
Yeah. Okay.
And so it uses similar forms and language and those sorts of things. So a weaker argument, but it's about what are the contemporary texts around it. And the seventh argument, I think this is actually a strong one for the old earthers, let's say, or for the people who take Genesis 1 metaphorically, and that is John chapter 1. In John chapter 1 verse 1 it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word through him all things were made." Nothing was made that has been made without him. Jesus is God the Word. So God the Son is God the Word.
Yeah.
And then you take that idea and you see that's a very deliberate riff on Genesis chapter 1 because it uses "in the beginning." John is very deliberately connecting his view of the Lord Jesus Christ with creation. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. So before he was incarnate as Jesus, God the Son was God the Word, through whom, the Word through whom God created the universe. And so you take about Genesis 1, you go, well, Genesis 1 is saying God said, but isn't that a metaphor for through, by means of God the Word, God created? Yeah. It's a very strong argument for people who believe in a longer time frame that John at the very least is saying you should read Genesis metaphorically or symbolically. So just as that argument at 2 Peter chapter 3, this argument is saying the gospel writers, at the very least John, took Genesis 1 metaphorically.
Which isn't that so interesting to have that idea of, well, Peter came from a different perspective and John's coming from a different perspective. So it shows you that even before, like even when we went back to the start of the history of this discussion, we're talking about Peter and John having as well different ways of explaining. Possibly
different ways of explaining it. So we're not in their minds. We don't know exactly what they thought. But it seems that John's giving us permission to read that way. And so you can look at those and go, well, we have permission perhaps to read the Genesis 1 that way. Yeah. It certainly seems that way. So they're the two lists of arguments. Both of them have their strengths and weaknesses, and both of them will have counter-arguments that you may even be sitting there thinking, well, I've got the answer to that one. And that's fine, that's okay. I'm just saying these are the positive arguments from the text of the Bible that give us permission to read Genesis in two very different ways.
Yeah. Now, you've brought that up a couple of times, and I actually want to kind of slow down and actually deal with that. That idea of permission to read the Bible two different ways. Because that in itself, I think, raises a lot of questions for people to be like, well, you don't even know how to read the Bible. Like, you don't all read the Bible the same. So why is it that there's any validity to the Bible in itself?
Oh, wow.
So
that's a really good question.
Can we deal with that question?
Okay. Let me see if I can say it without sounding completely stupid. The Bible is not interested in answering some questions, right? There are some questions that we are really interested in. The Bible just doesn't care about. And the old earth versus young earth is one of them. If the Bible had been interested, it could have actually really specifically outlined it with very much with verbal clarity, and could have said, "This is the only way you have permission to read the Bible." But it doesn't. Now the Bible does use 6 days. You're correct. The Bible does at points, not just Exodus chapter 20, but other places say in 6 days God created the world. But even that can be read as a symbolic kind of reference. People don't need to be saying in 6 literal 24-hour days. They could just be talking about the symbolism of creation. And so we have permission. The Bible doesn't ever definitively say. And so we have permission to have this argument. I think it's a little bit like baptism. If I could bring up yet another controversy that it will probably get me hung.
In what way?
The Bible gives us permission to actually understand baptism in different ways. And so if you're from a Baptist background, you will understand baptism to be adult believers' baptism, and you'll have strong arguments from the text of the Bible for that, because there are strong arguments from the text of the Bible for that. But equally, you could be someone from a tradition that baptises children. You could be a Presbyterian or an Anglican, those sorts of traditions. And there are really strong arguments in the Bible for understanding baptism that way. What do you do? Well, you give each other permission to read the Bible differently. I don't say, well, so I was converted into a Baptist church. I was baptised as an adult, but I don't then say, well, all Anglicans can't be Christians because they read the Bible differently, or they don't take the Bible seriously, or they're not. I don't say that. I say, no, Anglicans, Presbyterians are my brothers and sisters. They may think things differently to me, but that's okay. I have the maturity to step back and go, even though I've got a strong opinion, I understand the Bible gives us permission to read it differently here, because the Bible cares less about this question. What does the Bible care about? Well, we know what it cares about. It cares about the Lord Jesus Christ. It cares that Jesus is God in the flesh, that he came to save us from our sin, that he did that by becoming our high priest in Hebrews terms, or he did that by justifying us from the things we couldn't be justified from because of our sin. Jesus saves us by his death. He pays for our sins by his blood. And he's risen from the dead, and he's ascended to the right hand of God, and he rules even now. That is the core Christian proclamation. And the ideas that hang around that are important to that, about the Trinity, about the incarnation of Jesus, that he's both God and human, about all those sorts of things, they are about the church. They are core. So you cannot be a Christian and not believe in the church, for instance. But as a Christian who believes in the church, you could believe different things about the way we do church. And so we have a variety of ways we do church. Okay? And I think that's the thing. There are things that the Bible is actually very interested in and definitive about. And there are things that the Bible is less interested in that are our questions that it is less definitive about, and we're still exploring. I'm not saying that every answer is true, right? It obviously can't be true that it is both 6-day creation and a long old earth. It can't both be true, but the Bible's less interested in answering that question than we are. And so we have to allow for the fact that even though I might have a conviction and I've got to act on my conviction, I can't use that as a stick to beat other Christians with and say you're not a proper Christian if you don't agree with me. I know I can say that about the incarnation. If you don't believe that Jesus is God in the flesh, right, I can say you're not a proper Christian. That's not Christianity. Right? If you're denying that Jesus is both God and human, you are not a true Christian. That's not the true Christian faith. If you deny the Trinity, if you deny that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, yet not three gods but one, then you are not a real true Christian. If you deny that Jesus died for our sins, you're not a true Christian. If you deny that Jesus rose from the dead physically, in reality, not metaphorically, but really in physical reality, you're not a true Christian. Those things the Bible is definitive about and cares about, and we also ought to be definitive about. But these questions, it gives us permission to read them differently. And so we need to be generous in the way we interact with each other over it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And it leads me to another question in terms of how the Bible actually puts this. Because it's something that not many people might actually have put together, the fact that Moses wrote Genesis. Because I find that fascinating in itself. Because, as you said, if the Bible wanted us to know, it would have told us. So why, we're coming to a point, Moses is so long after, in a sense, the creation.
Well, depending on how old you think the earth is,
And yet, Genesis is all about that history kind of setting that up for us. And so, why do we not deal with that in itself?
Two things that's going on there. That's a question about Genesis itself as a book and those first 5 books of the Bible. There is history we have connection to and the ability to investigate, and there's history we don't have connection to, right? What we call prehistory. We don't have any records. We don't have any archaeology that tells us about this time period. That is Genesis 1 to 11. Genesis 1 to 11 is prehistory. There's no historical connection. Even though Christians sometimes try to dive back in there, they want evidence for Noah's Ark and evidence for There's no historical connection we can make to that time period.
Yeah.
It is before recorded history.
Yeah.
And so in Bible terms, Genesis 1 to 11 is God revealing to Israel through Moses the important things they need to know so that when they ground themselves in their history, they can understand it.
Yeah.
And so Genesis 1 to 11 takes us from the creation of the world to Abraham.
Yeah.
Because Abraham is the historical figure who's the beginning of the nation of Israel, the beginning of the time where God makes his promises to bless the world and save the world.
Yeah.
And what God gives them in Genesis 1 to 11 is enough of the prehistory that they can understand what's going on. And so we're not meant to therefore read Genesis 1 to 11 the same way we read Genesis 12 to 50 and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. We're meant to read it differently as revealed history. It's not recorded history, it's revealed history.
Yeah.
And therefore we've got to be careful about the pronouncements we make about it.
Yeah.
And what permissions it gives us.
Yeah.
There are definitely things from Genesis 1 to 11 that are just foundational, that you cannot, if you deny them, you're not a Christian.
Yeah.
You cannot deny that God is the creator of the universe. Yeah. You just can't deny that. Genesis 1 to 11 teaches us. You cannot deny that humanity was created by God as the pinnacle, the caretakers of creation under his rule. You cannot deny that we are created in the image of God. Now we can argue about what that might mean, but you can't deny that.
Yeah.
You cannot deny that God created us and we fell into sin. That we are the authors of sin, not God. And that evil is in the world because of us. So there are things here that are foundationally important. You cannot deny that God's grace, how God shows grace from the very beginning to people, and even after we sin, he's gracious and kind. Even in judgment, he's gracious and kind. You can't deny the structure of God's mercy and grace from those things. Otherwise, you are not a Christian. And so there are things that Genesis 1 to 11 teach us absolutely. Yeah. But there are other things that it teaches in a sense tangentially, or they're not as clear. They're not as concrete. Yeah. And I think the methodology, the time frame of creation is one of those. Yeah. The text gives us permission to read it in different ways. It's able to be read in these different ways, and so we've got to be careful about the judgments we make based on that. So anyone who says because you read Genesis differently than me, you're not a proper Christian, you're denying the Bible, you're undermining the foundations of the gospel, that's being disingenuous, and it's being, I think, ungodly. Yeah. And if someone's having a go at you like that, your best response is not to argue with them, but just to walk away. Yeah. Don't allow that to become an argument. Yeah.
It comes back to what you said at the start about pushing each other off the cliff. We need to move way back from that point, and we need to come back to that.
In the book of Titus, Paul talks about argumentative Christians, and it says warn them once, and then just don't have anything to do with them. Just walk away from them. Yeah. And the best thing to do with those things is to walk away from them, because it communicates to people that I don't want to talk about in that way. Yeah. And I don't think that's a great way for you to talk.
So this raises a lot of questions in terms of, okay, well, we've looked at this different way to read Genesis. There's these two kind of things, and you're bringing up this idea like, well, we can't know for sure. Like these are just permissions in ways for us to read the Bible. So why does it matter? What do we actually gain from all of this, and where do we go from here? Like if I've decided to read it a certain way, then what do I do with that? Yeah. How does that help?
Yeah, I think there's one is a clear conviction. I think it's useful to know what you think in your own mind, and to know what you don't know. Yeah. It's okay to not know. It's actually completely fine to go, I don't know, and I don't care. Yeah. Because the Bible doesn't care enough to actually make it that clear. Yeah. And so if you're someone who goes, I don't know and I don't care, that's fine, that's okay. As long as you believe the things that Genesis does teach us clearly, that's okay. I think as well, it helps us when we're convinced, though, if we have a conviction that it teaches one way or the other, to understand that conviction, but also understand other people who don't agree with us, and to understand on what basis we might have the discussion with them. I think it's entirely fine for Christians to sit down and have big fights about it, as long as they're generous, godly fights. I think, in that sense, to have an argument to try and arrive at what we think is true is completely okay. And I'll do that. I'm happy to do that. I will not do that on this forum, but I'm happy to sit down and have a coffee with you and argue the toss.
And as well that it's not about trying to bring us to this unified decision to say you need to believe what I need to believe. It's this is how we've both come to this, and this is why it's okay.
I think it helps you with your approach then to the world. So if I could just turn and say to non-Christian people who might watch this, I hope this helps you to understand Christians a little bit better, and that it's not all about you're just all stupid. There are actually more significant questions here. There are questions about where does the universe come from and how and why that Darwin series do not answer. That cosmological physics does not answer. Even if you, it doesn't matter whether you simply believe in the Big Bang as the origin of the universe, and therefore you ask the cosmological question, well, how and why did that start? Or if you believe in an infinite multiverse, there's still that question of what supports that idea, what supports materiality. That's a question that science will never answer because it cannot answer. You cannot answer the question of what supports material reality because we're inside of it. Okay, and so these questions that you scoff at Christians about are actually valid questions for you to ask yourself. And so please do that and engage with the Christians, I guess, well, as charitably as you feel like. As Christians, I think you want to be convinced in your own mind so that you can engage apologetically, that you can actually feel like, well, I need to know how to answer questions my non-Christian friends ask. And that's completely fine. Does that bring us to our book?
Well, I was going to say, I remember, and I was saying this about 5 years ago now, I didn't realise it was that long.
You're getting old.
Probably even 6 years ago.
You're so old.
But you gave this talk when I first came to BCS about this idea, and like for me, Christianity and actually putting my faith in God was new in terms of I actually need to start looking into this stuff by myself. And you posed this question, and I was like, I've never thought about this before. I've never thought about this idea of permission to read the Bible in different ways. Like for me, I was like, that's weird.
That's insane.
I didn't realise people could do that. But it actually raised that, oh wow, I actually want to understand more about this for my own faith. And you brought up this book, 7 Days That Divided the World by John Lennox. And I took you up on the offer and I went away and read it.
Let me hold that book to the closer to the camera so you can see it. 7 Days That Divide the World by John Lennox.
It was helpful because in a way it's what we've talked about today. He didn't come saying this is what you need to believe. He came helping me explore the Bible so that I could understand God and so that I could understand the words that I'm reading every day to actually build my convictions on what I believe. And I walked away being like, okay, well, I know what I want to think about now and how I would discuss it with someone. And I found that that open-endedness for him to say permission for you to read the Bible differently.
I think honestly the best thing about this book, you're right, one of the great things about it is it doesn't tell you what to think. It actually it talks about why we think these ways, and it's got some really helpful discussions there about how Christians have actually changed their minds on the Bible at different times and why. And so in particular it looks at that idea of the idea that scientists used to believe that the universe revolved around the Earth. But eventually we came to understand that the Earth revolves around the sun, and the universe is moving in all sorts of different ways, that it wasn't geocentric, Earth-centric, it was actually much more complex than that. But it took a long time, and we often think that's an argument between the church and science. It's actually not. It's an argument between old science and new science. And the Bible gives you permission to read it in different ways. The Bible gives you permission to read it as Earth-centric, because the sun rises, the sun sets. Those general kind of, that metaphorical language you use about life, because when we observe the world, the sun comes up and goes down. And so we've got this geocentric view, this Earth-centric view, and the Bible uses language that way because that's the way people use language. That's what but it gives you permission to read it the other way, to understand it the other way. And so what you see is a transition there. There was a time where Christians easily believed both, but when we saw that obviously, observationally, that the Earth revolves around the sun and the universe is a much more complex moving thing, that it wasn't a terrible thing for the church. It wasn't a terrible thing for Christians. It took us a little bit of time, but Christians don't generally talk about the Earth being the centre of the universe anymore. It's not. It's just one of those things.
It wasn't earth-shattering for us.
It wasn't earth-shattering.
In anything, it kind of, I think it's one of those things that's when you find out more, it it gives you,
Yeah.
again, that permission to read the Bible and be like, well, what does this really mean
Yeah.
then?
So I'm not saying with this current discussion about creation and evolution, we haven't really talked about it, but I'm not saying that there aren't significant questions to be asked of that model and in terms of understanding it with the Christian faith, but I'm saying we have permission just to be agnostic about it and to allow the chips to fall where they may.
Yeah.
And that's okay. Don't be worried about that. It doesn't destroy your understanding or reading of the Bible to be moved on these things. So don't worry if you think one thing and you're feeling like I need to move to think another thing or the other direction. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's all right because the Bible gives us permission to do that, and over time things will work out. And so that's the other encouragement I give you. It'll work out. Don't worry about it, and it won't work out because you're fighting about it. It'll just work out. Yeah.
So it's a bit of a hard discussion to wrap up because we haven't come to a solution or anything.
No, that's right. Yes.
But I want to ask you, for anyone who is perhaps wanting to know more, where do they go? What steps can they take to actually kind of build their own convictions and come to their own understanding?
Yeah. Look, I think a book like John Lennox's is really useful because it won't make you think a certain way, but it will help you to explore what you believe and help you to put a framework on that. And often for us, that's what we're seeking. We think we're looking for the answer to the question, but we're actually not, because there isn't the answer to the question. What we're looking for is a framework to help us to understand what we think and to help us, if we need to change the way we read the Bible, to change it well and for good reasons, rather than because my non-Christian friend's beating me over the head or some Christian shouting my ear roll about something, that I can actually read the Bible and be a better Bible reader. And so reading a book like that can help you, and just becoming a better Bible reader will help you. And so that sounds, it's ironic, isn't it? But it's a very simple answer, is read your Bible more. Because the more you read the Bible, the more connections and things you'll see, the more you'll understand how to read the Bible well. Because the Bible teaches you how to do that as you read it. It's one of the great things about the Bible as a book. And so that will be my encouragement, is don't worry, don't stress about it, don't allow yourself to be pushed around from either direction. But get better at reading the Bible yourself, and books like this are really helpful books. There are a lot of books that try and tell you what to think. This book is good because there are only very few things that'll tell you how to think. It'll tell you the Bible's important, but won't tell you must read it this way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's super helpful. Well, we've kept you here for probably long enough. Is there anything that you wanted to add as like a last minute before I close it up for us?
I feel like I just don't want to say anything else. I think I've said way too much. But be encouraged. And if you're not a Christian, don't feel like you can't ask your questions. You know, I'm happy. You know, you want to ask those questions. You know, if you want to be a bit snarky about it, sure. But if you want to ask a question honestly, that's entirely fine as well. We'll find some way to kind of to toss those things around. And if you're a Christian out there, just be encouraged.
Yeah. So we hope you guys have enjoyed this little chat, or long chat, perhaps. We're keen to keep on sitting down and having these deep chats and diving deeper. Because obviously there are heaps of questions out there. There is permission to read the Bible a whole bunch of different ways, and there are lots of questions that we want to know. So we are looking forward to perhaps some more questions coming out of this topic, or perhaps if you have anything else of a topic that you're really keen to kind of dive deeper with us, please shoot us a message, write a comment, let us know, because we're looking forward to perhaps doing this a bit more often. We'd love to do that. So so enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully your cup isn't too cold.